run down of some things that you've been, um, I guess, missing out on, for lack of a better word to put it. But anyways, real quickly, just going through a summary of cell respiration. I think I went over this maybe with you before, but I'm not sure. So again, everything always starts with glucose, and that's the beginning substance of cell respiration. So if you think of cell respiration as um, making some food of some kind, this is the main ingredient, it's glucose. And there's a process called glycolysis. That's this first process here. And that happens in the cytoplasm of every cell on Earth. And that takes the glucose and converts it to this substance called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. When it does, it makes ATP, two of them. There's two ATP molecules released at that point. And this is again in the cytoplasm. After that, depends on whether oxygen is present or not. If there is no oxygen, that's called anaerobic. And at that point, the pyruvate or the pyruvic acid gets converted to either alcohol or lactic acid, depending on the organism. If it's a yeast or bacteria, they make alcohol. If it's an animal, the muscle cells will make lactic acid if they're not getting enough oxygen. And there's some carbon dioxide released then as well. This is called fermentation, this part here produces zero ATP. So an organism that's doing this is only getting the 2 ATP from glycolysis from that original glucose. The other option is if there is oxygen present, that's called aerobic. At that point, the pyruvic acid gets processed in something called the Krebs cycle, and that produces carbon dioxide, a couple more ATPs, and a bunch of energy carriers. These are hydrogen-containing compounds that carry a ton of energy. And those get transferred onto this last part, which is called the electron transport chain, which makes tons of ATP, 34 of them, and also produces water. So on the aerobic side, you get 2 ATP from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs cycle, 34 from the electron transport chain. And that gives it approximately 38. Doesn't usually actually get 38, but that's ideally what it would get. Okay. And at that point, let's see here. Why is this? All right. So let's go. Let me show you something here. So the mitochondria, let me show you this quickly. So the two aerobic things take place in the mitochondria. Myself over here. So in the mitochondria, there's a membrane on the inside of the mitochondria, and very middle of the mitochondria, within that membrane, inside of the membrane, is what's called the matrix. It's the space in here. That's where the Krebs cycle happens. The electron transport chain actually happens embedded in the membrane. So the inner matrix is where the Krebs cycle is. The membrane, the inner membrane itself, embedded in that membrane, is where the electron transport chain occurs. Let me show you a little more about that. So this is what we went over in class that I don't think I went over with you yet. Some details about the Krebs cycle. So you can kind of just look at this to study it, or if you want to write it down. Again, this would be after glycolysis, when there's oxygen present, this thing called the Krebs cycle happens. Like it says here, the 2 pyruvates from glycolysis get converted into something called acetyl coenzyme A. That goes through the cycle here. And I don't want you to worry about all these steps and everything, but just know that the pyruvate from glycolysis becomes this stuff called acetyl coenzyme A. That goes through this cycle. And as it goes through the cycle, some things happen. The carbon dioxide that we all produce is released here in this Krebs cycle. And then all these NADHs, which carry a lot of energy, are produced. Something called FADH2 as well. and ATP, a little bit of ATP. So at the end of the Krebs cycle, what's made is 6 of these NADHs, 2 of the FADH2s, a couple ATP, and 4 carbon dioxides. So that's kind of what I want you to know about the Krebs cycle. And also know that these NADH, FADH2, again, you're not going to know what these are, what their structures are, anything like that, but I do want you to know that these are carrying a lot of energy in the form basically of hydrogens that are attached to them. A lot of energy. And these are going to go on to the electron transport chain, just these hydrogen energy carrying compounds. The ATP can get used by cells at that point. The CO2 escapes from the cell. It's waste. You got to get rid of it. All right. I'm not going to ask you to know all these steps. So let's jump down to the electron transport chain, and I'll explain a little bit of this to you here. So location-wise, again, this is embedded in the membrane. So here you see that membrane, the inside membrane of the mitochondria is in this picture here. And the whole point of electron transport chain really is to make all that ATP. Basic idea of how it works. So there's going to be, this is the inside of the with on the one side of the membrane in the middle. This is that matrix area. This is where the Krebs cycle was happening. The Krebs cycle was making this stuff, if you remember, NADH, FADH2. What happens is those things use their energy to release their hydrogens through these carriers to the other side of the membrane. So you end up with a lot of hydrogen on the outside. Okay, I'll say that again. The inside here is where the Krebs cycle happened. If you remember, the Krebs cycle produced these NADHs and FADH2s. They have a lot of energy. They use that energy to release their hydrogens across the membrane. So you end up with a bunch of hydrogen outside the membrane. If you remember from cell transport, basic diffusion, wherever there's a lot of something and whether there's a less of something, it's going to go from where it's high to low. So once all that hydrogen builds up out there, that hydrogen wants to get back inside just because it's going from high to low. And it goes through another protein called ATP synthase. And as it goes through there, it uses the energy of that hydrogen racing through there to build ATP. So it's literally like a little, kind of like a water mill, sort of. As the hydrogen's coming through, it's sort of spinning this molecule, and that energy is being used to make ATP. So that's how the things work together. And a couple final notes. So why do we breathe oxygen? Well, oxygen is needed for this electron transport chain final step. There's some electrons that get kind of kicked out of these molecules as the hydrogens are going out, and those electrons go through some reactions. They eventually get released to the inside, and they need something to accept them, to take them, and that's what oxygen does. So in reality, the oxygen gas we breathe combines the electrons, the hydrogens that came back inside with themselves. So you have oxygen plus 4 electrons plus 4 hydrogens makes a couple water molecules, and that's what we breathe out and as a result of cell respiration. Okay, so kind of all said and done, the electron transport chain uses 10 NADHs, 2 FADH2s, and oxygen, and it makes water and 34 ATPs. Okay, so going back to this again, looking at the whole process again. So it starts always with glucose, does this thing called glycolysis, makes pyruvate. And what we were just talking about is when there's oxygen available, that pyruvate will go through this first thing called the Krebs cycle, makes carbon dioxide, a couple ATPs, and all those hydrogen energy carriers. Those get transferred on to the electron transport chain, which uses that hydrogen movement energy to make ATP. And then, as you know, oxygen combines with the hydrogens, makes water. All right, so that's the basic gist of cell respiration. Again, you can write down what you want, watch this a couple times. I think you'll pick it up. Good luck.